Hello everybody, thanks for tuning in. In this video we will be going over and demonstrating how to connect the inverter's communication system to the batteries, setting up the dip switches, putting in the cables, and installing the bridge for communication. There will be a couple of things I want to address. This will be going over how to do the connections, and ideally the outcome will work perfectly. For some of you it will, from my understanding. For some of us it won't. I have a 24 volt battery bank. These batteries are the EG4-LL LifePower4 24 volt 200 amp hour batteries. I cannot get mine to communicate with this particular Growatt. This is a Growatt SPF 3000 TL LVM-ES, and when I set it up in the configurations, I continue to get an error message. So we will go over that in the video. The good thing is I'll show you how to do all the wiring, and some of the folks out there I know have configured it successfully without any issues, and they are using the same configuration I have set up. So with that note, let's get started. A couple of things we're going to need. We are going to need a patch cable. We're actually going to need 3 patch cables. In this instance I am running 2 inverters in split phase in parallel, meaning I'm going to need a patch cable from here. I am going to need a patch cable from here. That will connect down to a basic switch. All this acts as is a bridge. It's not a Wi-Fi router. It's a very simple setup, no configuration at all. Basically you're going to set one patch cable from each inverter in the RJ485 jack. That will go into the bridge, into this port. You'll have another patch cable going from this inverter into the bridge, any of the ports, and then from there we will run one more wire going down to the number 1 address in the battery. Actually it will be the number 0 address in the battery, and I'll explain why in the dip switch settings. With that note, let's get started. Now, a couple things we will want to remember is the communications between the inverters and the batteries is only going to happen with lithium batteries. So one, you're going to have to make sure you have lithium batteries before you're going to try and cable and get communications from the inverter to the batteries. The other is you're going to want to make sure that the inverters that you purchased, if it's not Growatts, that they actually have the capacity to communicate between battery management systems on batteries, lithium batteries, and inverters. Once we know we have lithium batteries and we're going to do the configurations, we're going to have to figure out what type of communication ports we have on our inverters. On these particular inverters, I'll show you a close-up. You have a RS485 port, which uses a RJ45 connection, like a regular computer connecting cable. It's called a patch cable. And the CAN port. The CAN port will use the exact same type of cable, but it will be set up on a whole different type of communication. It's the same, but it's different. In this case, with this particular setup, these particular lithium batteries, these Growatts, we will be using the RS45 port. We do have 2 inverters, so we will need to use some type of a bridge connection. This is just a basic little hub, basic little router. It's not a router, it's actually a switch. I call them a bridge. All you're really doing is plugging in one end of the inverters into the ports, and then basically you'll have one cable coming out that is going to run down to the battery and be installed in the communication port of the battery. These you can pick up for $10, $15 anywhere. I bought this one I think for $14 at Home Depot. It's not a router, remember, it's a bridge, it's a switch. They'll sell it to you as a switch. It acts like a bridge. If you see bridge, you can buy a bridge as well. It's just a very basic little setup for connecting the cables. In this case, connecting these 2 inverters to one device, and then the cable, one cable will go out down to the communication port of the batteries. I'll show you how we do that. So one of the first things we're going to want to do is safety first. Let's shut off all of our batteries. Make sure we shut off the quick disconnect between the batteries. Shut off the solar panels. Shut off the inverters. And shut off the breaker to the inverters. So now we have no power. Make sure these are off. I like to double check everything, and breakers are off. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is connect our switch, our bridge. Basically just going to connect that to a 120. I'm not going to mount this until later if we get it configured. I don't know if some of you other people have watched my other video, but I can't get these inverters to communicate with the BMS on the battery, so we're going to give it another try. This time using the switch. The first time I tried it, I didn't use a switch and bridge. I was trying to set up with a configuration of one inverter at a time to make it a little easier on the electronics. It's a lot easier to configure one device, one battery, than it is to configure two devices to 4 batteries, right? So I was trying with one. This time I'm going to try with 2. Maybe we'll have success and have luck, and we'll learn something in the process. So I have this connected. You don't need to connect it to the power yet. You're going to need 3 of the patch cables I showed you. Basically just regular Ethernet Cat 5 cables. We are going to connect them to the RS-485 ports on the bottoms of these inverters. Connect one of them to the hub here. Like I say, there's not a port 1 or 2 or 3. There's not a main. There's not a internet Wi-Fi connection in. This is just a bridge, so you should be able to connect them anywhere. Connect the number 2 patch cable that's going to go to the inverter number 2. We'll come up, we'll connect this patch cable to this inverter. Make sure that it is in the RS-485 port. Make sure that it's nice and secure. You should hear a click, and you do. On this other cable, we are going to run directly down to the RS-485 port of our number 1 battery. It actually won't be number 1, it will be labeled as 0, the address reserved for communications of the inverters to the batteries. I'll show you that in a minute. We'll connect this one to the top battery, which I'm going to use here, which will be my number 0. Now that we have the cables in place, I'm going to reset the switch here just in case. That's all set up. So we have the physical side of the connection established, the cables, the patch cables connected from the inverters to the switch or passive hub here, bridge, and from the bridge down to the number 1 battery that we're going to be using. It won't be an actual number 1, it will be identified as address 0, I believe. So now we need to set these dip switch settings on all 4 of these batteries. Each one of them is going to be a unique address so that you're not repeating any of the sequence in the batteries. If you have 1, well, it's pretty easy for you. If you have 2, 3, 4, 5, or 50, you're going to want to make sure that these dip switch settings, none of them are set to the same setting. And you're also going to want to make sure that none of them are set to address number 1, because that one is reserved for the inverter communication port. So this cable comes down from our little bridge, our little passive hub, and connects to the RS-485 port. In this case, on our first battery in the sequence, we're going to set that to address number 0. So in the manual it says pin 1 on, pin 2 on, pin 3 on, and pin 4 on. So from the sequence here you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4. All of them on is down. See a little arrow on down there. Manual says the switch position denotes a binary code scheme where off is up, is 1, and on is down. A little confusing for those that won't know. So everything down here is actually on. And address setting 0, according to the manual, is on, 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 on. So we have this one set to 0. Remember, address number 1 is reserved for the inverter comms, so we will jump down to battery number 2. Battery number 2, set that address to number 2, which is on, off, on. So we have on, off, on. Battery number 3 will be on, off, off. We have on, off, off. Doesn't help with the guys with big fingers, right? And battery number 4 will be on, off, on, off, on. Now we have configured all 4 batteries. Dip switch settings. One of the most important things to remember in setting these switches, you don't have to be in sequence of address 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You do need to make sure that you are not using address number 1 in this particular case with this particular battery. The address number 1, which is the dip switch on, off, is reserved for the communications of the inverter. Don't set any of your batteries. If you have 50 or you have 4 or 1, don't set any of them to the number 1 address. Otherwise you'll have a confliction in the communication. Other than that, what you want to do is just make sure that not one of these single dip switches matches another one. Otherwise you will also have a conflict in the communication. Other than that, this part of it is configured. Let's move on to the next step. We are going to have to set up in the configuration in each of these inverters. We're going to have to set the setting on number 5 to lithium. Okay, I have turned on my AC in, so the only current that is being provided to inverter number 1 is coming from the AC. That way I don't have any conflictions from the battery, obviously, or the PV system. So obviously you see error code 56 there. That is a open communication, I believe, on the batteries, because the batteries are not connected right now, right? We have that shut-off switch in place. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hold down this button. We're going to go into the configuration, which I believe is setting number 5, and we are going to program that to lithium. Now that we have lithium, the program setting number 36 comes up. Here we will need to choose between protocol 1 through 50, protocol 51 through 99. The first ones mentioned, protocol 1 through protocol 50, are communicating through the RS-45 port. In this case, we have connected to the RS-45 port, so we're definitely going to want to use one of those connections. The first one on the list, protocol 1, which we shouldn't have any issues with any other communication, we'll need to set to number 1. And that one's set. We'll need to do that same thing on the other inverter. Okay, we're going to repeat that same setup that we did on inverter number 1 onto inverter number 2. Scroll up to number 5 setting here, come over. It's on lithium, so obviously it picked up from the other inverter because I didn't have the switch before. Okay, so we are now back at inverter number 1, and we are going to go into the settings of 12, 13, and 21. Remember, those aren't settable unless you have program setting number 5 set to lithium, which in this case we do, and that should allow us to program setting number 12. Once we're here, let's double check that lithium stayed. It did. Let's go up into 12 and let's set this. By default it's set to 50%. I have it set to 40%. It says it is settable from the range of 6 to 95%. What is this doing? This is setting the SOC, which is state of charge, point back to utility source when selecting SBU or solar first priority. In number 1 we have this set to SBU, and so it basically is saying, hey, the batteries are down to 40%. In this case, I don't think it goes to actual percent. I think, which I'll show you later, the display rounds down to 25, 50, 75, and 100%, and then 0. So I imagine it'll go down to, once it hits 25% or 49% in here, the communication probably automatically goes back to utility. I don't like that. I would prefer that these go down to about 15% of the total capacity of the batteries. So, you know, you're completing more of a cycle in those batteries using all the energy that you've accumulated. Now I did try and go in here and bring it down to 15, which is, yeah, very low. And if you basically lose all of your charge in your batteries, you could lose the battery completely. I'm okay with going to 15%, but it won't keep anyways. The lowest I can actually set it to is 40%. So I don't like that, but hey, that's what it is, so we're going to live with that one. Let's go up to program 13, and program setting 13 says setting the state of charge point back to battery mode when selecting SBU or solar first. So basically what it's going to say is, hey, okay, the batteries are at 40%, so let's stop communicating with the batteries, or let's stop taking the charge from the batteries to distribute to the house, and let's actually go to the utility and bring it from there. Well, now when the utility is charging up these batteries, this basically is going to be the option where you shut it off. When do we want to shut off? 95% is good. We could set it to, the range I guess says from 10 to 100% settable. Well, we know 40 doesn't work, and we don't want that, so if it's going to charge, we might as well at least charge it up to 90%, just to be sure. Leave a 10% room there for anything else. Let's see if it holds, and it holds, so that was settable. So to repeat, this setting here will stop pulling current from the utility, charging the batteries when the battery says 90%. Again, the way these display settings work, it probably will stop at either 75% or 100%. I couldn't tell you. The detail of how it does it isn't clear enough for me to make a statement. So let's go up to setting number 21. Setting number 21 says low DC cutoff at state of charge if L1 is selected in program 5. So this says volts, it doesn't say percentage. Actually, it does say percentage. I wish it said volts, it'd be easier to set, right? It says percentage. The default's at 20%. I'd like to know what volt that comes to. I guess that's probably 20%. Where's that? I have no idea. Maybe 40 volts? I don't know. I'm going to leave it at 20%. Okay, so I did go to inverter number 2, sorry, in the sequence. I know this says PV1, PV2. That has to do with the PV panels I have. This is in the sequence. This is set up as inverter number 1. This would be the slave number 2. I did go into inverter number 2 and check the configuration file to make sure that settings 12, 13, and 21 that I adjusted here actually took effect here, and they did. That is a result of this communication cable. It's a DB9 connector that goes between inverters. There's only one way to connect that. You want to make sure everything is off, obviously, before connecting those DB9 connectors. Now, I did shut off all the electricity. There is no electricity going to this at all. First thing we want to do is make sure that the inverters are off. They are off. Turn on our batteries, which I already turned them on. The on-off switches on the batteries. I'm going to verify them. On, and I have 4 batteries. Then we're going to turn on the quick disconnect here for power. You want to make sure these inverters are off before connecting that on. We should get it to fire up once we turn an inverter on. And it should take away our error 56. We have error code 4, and we have error code 20. What does it say in our pamphlet on error code 4 and error code 20? Well, let's have a look. One thing that I do notice is we're actually getting a different voltage reading from the batteries that we normally do, so something's actually working there. Error 20 message is BMS communication error. So what it's telling me is that there's now communication going between the BMS and the batteries. Now, this is the conclusion that I came to originally. I've configured everything correctly. I'm going to go over everything twice, check it all out, make sure my little trusted hub is actually working, connected, has power. The little hub has power. I'm going to reset these one more time. Let's shut them off. Shut off the AC power. I shut off the quick disconnect on the batteries. And I am going to disconnect the PV. And I'm going to shut off the batteries. Everything is off once again. First thing I am going to do is turn on the batteries, make sure the inverters are off. They are off. Batteries are fired up. Quick disconnects are on. Let's fire up inverter number 1. Fire up inverter number 2. So you can see on here the configuration says L1, so at least the configuration took place. Let's turn on our solar. Solar came on. And we still have error code number 20, which is communication error code. So let's go check the dip switches. Let's check all of our configurations. Let's make sure the ports on the hubs are good. Let's make sure that the cables are good. And see if we can't get rid of error message 20. Okay, you guys can see I have everything powered on, and okay, you guys can see I have everything powered on. I have the ports, I have the dip switches configured on each battery correctly. I am going to go through and check those again. I have the Ethernet connections connected, the RJ45s to the RS485 ports correctly. It appears as though it's working because you have which shows the setting here says LI, which is lithium. Here shows the voltage of those batteries, 51.7. I'm going to test those just to see if that's accurate. And what I don't like is I am getting error 20, which is a communication error between the batteries. There shouldn't be any communication errors between the batteries, and the fact that my batteries are extremely low, these inverters should kick on because it's set at 40%, right, on setting 12. If my batteries are below 40%, at this case they're definitely below 25%. As you can see here, the battery level there is basically nothing. And when I look at the light on the battery, it shows me that I'm at 25% or less, or 50% or less. And these are set at 40%. So, and they're flashing red. When they flash red, from my understanding with those EG4s, they're basically very low. So they're below 25%. They're probably around 15%, 10%. They need to charge. I've had these running for about 10 minutes. So the inverters have plenty of time to cycle through and actually start their charge. I'm getting that error message. I don't like that. Doesn't give me any confidence. I am going to go back to user setting on my battery configuration. We'll go do that together. I'll shut off my inverters. I'm going to shut off my batteries. And I'm going to go up to user define. Right back to square one. That effect should take effect on the other inverter, which I am going to check. Inverter number 2, and it automatically updated. Let's turn the batteries back on. Let's turn the inverters on. Inverter number 1, inverter number 2. Let's see what happens after the setting has been changed back to user mode. Of course, it tells me my batteries are full. My batteries are not full. And I'll click on the solar. 182 volts coming in, and a 50.6 volts coming out of the batteries. Turn on the grid. Okay, so as you guys can see, that's the problem I had originally with these. I did it before with one inverter talking to one battery. I couldn't get away from that error message number 20. Didn't give me any confidence. It appears as though it reads the battery correctly, but does it? I don't like the detail in the battery. Sure, it's a cool little option, but when you're dealing with the energy, you're dealing with the batteries, you're dealing with lithium, it's nice to know an exact percentage. I mean, yeah, it would be nice to be able to take advantage of the feature of the electronics and software in the inverters actually communicating with the electronics and the software in the BMS. That's not happening on lithium with this 3000 TL LVM-ES and the EG4-LL 24 volt batteries. Maybe there's a certain level of communication going on, but not all of it. As you can see, these inverters have kicked on. I went back to user setting on number 5. Inverters kicked on instantly. They're running, and I have confidence that they'll actually charge the batteries when they get too low, because I've watched it cycle through that process. As you can see, on the user settings, the percentage of the battery is showing 50%, and it actually lowered the voltage from 51.5 down to 50.5. Now we are of course consuming energy, so that probably is bringing the voltage down. But why don't we connect the computer just to see exactly what's being distributed through the software, reading directly from the battery, so that we don't have to trust in anything that the inverters are saying. Okay, so we've got the computer here. Let's connect our communication cable here. We have an RS-485 connection. We're going to plug it into the battery number 1. We are going to plug it into the USB on the computer. Open up our communication software here. Software management program is open. We are connected to battery number 1. And let's search. This is the other part of the configuration that I don't quite agree with on those EG4s. They are connected in sequence with the little parallel patch cables there connecting each one of them, so that it should give me a display on this side of all 4 batteries. It doesn't do that. I have to connect my patch cable, this communication cable, to each battery if I want to read it. I can't get it away. I can get it to change this pack number, but I can't get it to show all 4 batteries as some of the other videos out there do. So what we wanted to check now is actual voltage on this battery, just to see where we're at. So we're at 25.92 voltage. I wanted to check and see if this will actually match what is on the inverter, and right now on the inverter it is 51.9. Now to verify this, well, obviously we need to times 2, right? So let's do it a little different. Let's connect, we have 25.92 volts on this one. I'm going to connect the RS-485 on battery number 2 of this parallel connection. I'm going to search, pull up our calculator. We've got 25.92 plus whatever gets displayed here, to see how accurate of a reading the inverters are displaying when setting 5 is set to user defined. I want to see if that little display setting actually matches what's being set on each particular battery. Now I do have a Victron battery monitoring device. I can use that as well, but hey, let's go directly to the source. So the second battery is actually coming in on the same series at 25.96. So we have 25.92 plus our 25.96 gives us 51.88, and on the inverter number 2, you can actually see we're at 51.9. The fact that that thing doesn't have a 10th or a 100th decimals, it's probably rounding up to the top one. User defined setting on this particular Growatt seems to be working correct with voltage reading anyways. So where do we go from here? Well, that's a good question. If anybody has any ideas or has seen something that I've done incorrectly, please let me know. That brings me back to the original testing that I did. I did thoroughly go through testing separate settings on dip switches, setting up sequence from 5 to 10 or from 15 to 20, making sure that none of the dip switches were repeated. I did set up separate patch cables that I actually made using the CAN ports to see if that would make a difference. That didn't make any difference. I can't get away from error number 20, which is the BMS communication error from the inverter. That doesn't give me any confidence. As you can see, I left it on. I actually left it on for 10-15 minutes while it was giving me that low voltage error, which I believe was number 4, and it doesn't start pulling power from the grid. I suppose I could sit and watch it, monitor the actual state of charge of the batteries to see if it was actually low enough to kick on the inverter's trigger switch to actually go over and start pulling from the utility of the grid. But I don't have any confidence in the fact that it's giving me an error message code when it appears that everything is configured correctly. So if anybody has any solutions or ideas, please let me know. I'd love to be able to take advantage of the option of the lithium integration on these inverters with the lithium batteries. Again, thanks for watching. Hope you learned something. As always, safety first. Remember that, guys. You're not going to get a second chance with electricity, so don't get complacent. Always stay alert, have fun, and we'll see you in the next video.